Professor Jim Jost out of the University of Newcastle. Firstly, mate, how was your Christmas, January, Australia Day, all of that? Pretty good?
Yep. Everything was fine, Mark. It was a great break and back relaxed and refreshed.
Tell you what, there was a heck of a lot of politics happening over the summer break. However, we'll kind of hit a bit of a reset and look towards 2021. We'll start with, of course, the government. What do we think of their projections looking forward, and Scott Morrison as PM in particular?
Well, Prime Minister gave his speech to the press club, which was a sort of reset in a sense that he basically mapped out not so much where the government was definitely going, but sort of where he thought it would go, where he liked to think it would go. For example, his comment about his personal preference is to try and reach zero emission targets on carbon and so forth by 2050, which is the targets being set by some of the trading partners of Australia. That's not so much committing the government, it's more or less sort of signalling what he perhaps might like, but if it doesn't happen, then that's not, the big issue.
I think always when you look at, and regardless of what you think of, I guess, of climate change or energy as an issue, I think 2050 is so far down the road. If you look in Parliament, Jim, there's pretty much not going to be anybody that's sitting now that's going to be in 2050.
Well, I guess that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, Mark, is that part of the thing that we hope our politicians are capable of doing, and there's probably a round of arguments that suggest that they're not, but we like to think that they look beyond their time in Parliament, that some of the big picture issues that they're able to put in place that they may not themselves be around to see come to fruition, but their descendants and the grandchildren of our descendants are all able to enjoy the benefits of what they've put in place. So the government is at present treading very lightly, not trying to be tied down to any one particular dimension, and there are a number of areas where it's I think looking towards positioning itself for the possibility of an early election. Now, the Prime Minister has ruled that out technically in the sense that he's made the statement that he's a full-term government, but he's also a master of marketing and a master of positioning himself, and I suspect that should the opportunity arise, and there's a good case to be made that there will arise, that towards the end of the year, as the COVID pandemic appears, all things being equal, appears to be under control, a vaccine is being rolled out, assuming no major difficulties or hidden side effects or problems arising from that rollout, Mark, the government will be looking, and the Prime Minister in particular, will be looking at the calculation of, if we go to the polls before Christmas, we can secure another 3 years, as opposed to people forgetting the management of COVID, the performance of the government, etc., in relation to COVID, and suddenly begin to realise there are other issues that perhaps have become more important, and then turn around and punish the government.
Yeah, that's true. We can be very, forgetful is the right word, but we can sort of move on a little bit, I guess. Perhaps as well, another thing that may come into play is, and I'm sure we'll get onto this in the next couple of weeks, but the opposition, Albo and all of that stuff. On the vaccine, though, it's very interesting, Jim. I think the government seems, to me anyway, has had this very good way of marketing it, is that, look, we are being cautious and seeing what's happening in other parts of the world, not rushing, but yet at the same time, it just does always feel like it's around the corner within within a week or so. It has that vibe for those who really want to run out and take it.
Well, I think it's reasonable to say that the government is being cautious, taking its small steps rather than jumping in and doing something immediately. I think it's waiting and seeing, having a look at the possible ramifications elsewhere, making sure that we don't then have to go through the same thing as a nation. And I think that is probably, it's both good politics, but it's also sensible government. Whether they are, with hindsight, will we look back and say, well, they could have done it earlier, but provided things go smoothly for the government, most people are going to look at that and say the government has managed this quite effectively. It's the other issues that are bubbling along that aren't getting much airplay, and the government's also in a good position with respect to the opposition, regardless of what the polls are saying, because the leadership debate has now begun to erupt. And let's face it, this is largely journalism with nothing better to write about. There's no real reason why that needs to happen. However, politically, there are various factions, not just within the Labor Party, but various interests that need to try and ensure that whoever is leading the Labor Party aligns with where they want to go. And at the moment, we probably would see those interests in terms of the resources industries, the energy industries, wanting to ensure that the Labor leadership is, on the same page as the Morrison government. To have a Labor Party or Labor leadership moving in a different direction might threaten those particular interests. But they're not the only interests. I mean, there are a whole range of areas. There's the service industries, the tourism industry, education industry, the manufacturing industry. These are all vying for influence as well. And at the moment, they're sort of playing second fiddle to the resources industry, but that could all change over the next 12 months.
Interesting you mentioned some of those other industries, Jim, and that was the last point I was going to get to today is we know that the end of March will happen and a lot of the, the subsidies, the JobKeeper, JobSeeker, a lot of that changes, a lot of that just rolls away completely. Would it be fair to say that the government has very keenly got an eye on what happens post-Easter to see what happens, and that may influence election, no election?
Well, I think so. I think they will have an eye on that, and for the most part, the big picture things they probably have reasonably well in hand. The issues, though, are going to be around the relationship between those who have been affected by COVID, both small businesses and employees, and the fact that the support for employees is going to dry up at the end of March, and there's not going to be enough jobs and not enough jobs in the right places. It's all very well saying, well, there are dozens, hundreds of jobs in the fruit picking industry that are needed. But for, people raising families, it's very difficult for them to sort of up stakes and go out and engage in that sort of work. So it's not just simply...
It's not a one-size-fits-all.
Well, there's going to be more people needing jobs than there are jobs. And then that's the first point. And the second point is that the jobs that are necessarily available may well be the sorts of jobs, the gig economy jobs, that have been part of the problem in the COVID pandemic that has led to all sorts of unintended consequences. And some form of employment policy which looks to a much more stable and better outcome for employees needs to be thought about. As yet, the government is big on saying we have a plan and we're working to it, but the details are pretty vague and, they can make it sound like anything that they want it to sound. But then that's the art of politics to some extent and the art of ensuring that one stays one step ahead.
Jim, it is going to be a big year. As always, thanks for your time and welcome back for 2021.
My pleasure, Mark. It's great to be back.
Our Professor of Politics, he is from the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Jose at 2NURFM.
2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.